Politics by Aristotle, translated by Benjamin Howitt. So we have book 8 here, from 1 to 8. Book 1, part 1. Every state is a community of some kind, and every community is established with a view to some good. For mankind always act in order to obtain that which they think good. But if all the communities aim at some good, the state or political community, which is the highest of all, and which embraces all the rest, aims at good in a greater degree than any other and at the highest good. Some people think that the qualifications of a statesman, king, householder, and master are the same, and that they differ not in kind but only in the number of their subjects. For example, the ruler over a few is called a master, over more, the manager of a household, over a still larger number, a statesman or king, as if there were no difference between a great household and a small state. The distinction which is made between the king and the statesman is as follows. When the government is personal, the ruler is a king. When, according to the rules of the political science, the citizens rule and are ruled in turn, then he is called a statesman. But all this is a mistake, for governments differ in kind, as will be evident to anyone who considers the matter according to the method which has hitherto guided us. As in other departments of science, so in politics, the compound should always be resolved into the simple elements or least part of the whole. We must therefore look at the elements of which the state is composed, in order that we may see in what the different kinds of rule differ from one another, and whether any scientific result can be attained about each one of them. Part 2. He who thus considers things in their first growth and origin, whether a state or anything else, will obtain the clearest view of them. In the first place, there must be a union of those who cannot exist without each other, namely of male and female, that the race may continue. And this is a union which is formed not of deliberate purpose, but because, in common with other animals and with plants, mankind have a natural desire to leave behind them an image of themselves and of natural ruler and subject, that both may be preserved. For that which can foresee by the exercise of mind is by nature intended to be lord and master, and that which can with its body give effect to such foresight is a subject, and by nature a slave. Hence, master and slave have the same interest. Now, nature has distinguished between the female and the slave, for she is not niggardly like the smith who fashions the Delphian knife for many uses. She makes each thing for a single use, and every instrument is best made when intended for one and not for many uses. But among barbarians, no distinction is made between women and slaves, because there is no natural ruler among them. They are a community of slaves, male and female. Wherefore the poets say, it is meet that Hellenes should rule over barbarians, as if they thought that the barbarian and the slave were by nature one. Out of these two relationships between man and woman, master and slave, the first thing to arise is the family. And Hesiod is right when he says, first house and wife and an ox for the plough. For the ox is the poor man's slave. The family is the association established by nature for the supply of men's everyday wants, and the members of it are called by Cronads, companions of the cupboard, and by Epimenides, the Cretan, companions of the manager. But when several families are united and the association aims at something more than the supply of daily needs, the first society to be formed is the village, and the most natural form of the village appears to be that of a colony from the family, composed of the children and grandchildren who are said to be suckled with the same milk. And this is the reason why Hellenic states were originally governed by kings, because the Hellenists were under royal rule before they came together, as the barbarians still are. Every family is ruled by the eldest, and therefore, in the colonies of the family, the kingly form of government prevailed because they were of the same blood, as Homer says. Each one gives law to his children and to his wives, for they lived dispersedly, as was the manner in ancient times. Wherefore men say that the gods have a king, because they themselves either are or were in ancient times under the rule of a king. For they imagine not only the forms of the gods, but their ways of life to be like their own. When several villages are united in a single complete community, large enough to be nearly or quite sufficing, the state comes into existence, originating in the bare needs of life and continuing in existence for the sake of a good life. And therefore, if the earlier forms of society are natural, so is the state, for it is the end of them, and the nature of a thing is its end. For what each thing is when fully developed, we call its nature, whether we are speaking of a man, a horse, or a family. Besides, the final cause and end of a thing is the best, and to be self sufficing is the end and the best. Hence, it is evident that the state is a creation of nature, and that man is by nature a political animal, and he who by nature and not by mere accident is without a state is either a bad man or above humanity. He is like the tribeless, lawless, hearthless one, whom Homer denounces. The natural outcast is forthwith a lover of war. He may be compared to an isolated piece at draughts. Now that man is more of a political animal than bees or any other gregarious animals is evident. Nature, as we often say, makes nothing in vain, and man is the only animal whom she has endowed with the gift of speech. And whereas mere voice is but an indication of pleasure or pain, and is therefore found in other animals, for their nature attains to the perception of pleasure and pain, and the intimation of them to one another and no further. The power of speech is intended to set forth the expedient and inexpedient, and therefore likewise the just and the unjust. And it is a characteristic of man that he alone has any sense of good and evil, of just and unjust, and the like, and the association of living beings who have this sense makes a family and a state. Further, the state is by nature clearly prior to the family and to the individual, since the whole is of necessity prior to the part. For example, if the whole body be destroyed, there will be no foot or hand except in an equivocal sense, as we might speak of a stone hand, for when destroyed, the hand will be no better than that. But things are defined by their working and power, and we ought not to say that they are the same when they no longer have their proper quality, but only that they have the same name. To prove that the state is a creation of nature and prior to the individual is that the individual, when isolated, is not self sufficing, and therefore is like a part in relation to the whole. But he who is unable to live in society, or who has no need because he is sufficient for himself, must be either a beast or a god. He is no part of a state. A social instinct is implanted in all men by nature, and yet he who first founded the state was the greatest of benefactors. For man, when perfected, is the best of animals, but when separated from law and justice, he is the worst of all. Since armed injustice is the more dangerous, and he is equipped at birth with arms meant to be used by intelligence and virtue, which he may use for the worst ends. Wherefore, if he have not virtue, he is the most unholy and the most savage of animals, and the most full of lust and gluttony. But justice is the bond of men in states for the administration of justice, which is the determination of what is justice, is the principle of order in political society. Seeing then that the state is made up of households, before speaking of the state, we must speak of the management of the household. The parts of household management correspond to the persons who compose the household, and a complete household consists of slaves and free men. Now we should begin by examining everything in its fewest possible elements, and the first and fewest possible parts of a family are master and slave, husband and wife, father and children. We have therefore to consider what each of these three relations is and ought to be. I mean, the relation of master and servant, the marriage relation, the conjunction of man and wife has no name of its own. And thirdly, the procreative relation, this also has no proper name. And there is another element of household, the so called art of getting wealth, which according to some is identical with household management, according to others, a principal part of it. The nature of this art will also have to be considered by us. Let us first speak of master and slave, looking to the needs of practical life and also seeking to attain some better theory of their relation than exists at present. For some are of opinion that the rule of a master is a science, and that the management of a household and the mastership of slaves and the political and royal rule, as I was saying at the outset, are all the same. Others affirm that the rule of a master over slaves is contrary to nature, and that the distinction between slave and free man exists by law only and not by nature, and being an interference with nature is therefore unjust. Part 4. Property is a part of the household, and the art of acquiring property is a part of the art of managing the household. For no man can live well, or indeed live at all, unless he be provided with necessaries. And as in the arts which have a definite sphere, the workers must have their own proper instruments for the accomplishment of their work, so it is in the management of a household. Now, instruments are of various sorts. Some are living, others lifeless. In the rudder, the pilot of a ship has a lifeless. In the lookout man, a living instrument. For in the arts, the servant is a kind of instrument. Thus, too, a possession is an instrument for maintaining life. And so, in the arrangement of the family, a slave is living possession and property, a number of such instruments, and the servant is himself an instrument which takes precedence of all other instruments. For if every instrument could accomplish its own work, obeying or anticipating the will of others, like the statues of Daedalus or the tripods of Hephaestus, which says the poet, of their own accord entered the assembly of the gods. If, in like manner, the shuttle would weave and the plectrum touch the lyre without a hand to guide them, chief workmen would not want servants nor masters, slaves. Here, however, another distinction must be drawn. The instruments commonly so called are instruments of production, whilst a position is an instrument of action. The shuttle, for example, is not only of use but something else is made by it. Whereas of a garment or of a bed, there is only the use. Further, as production and action are different in kind and both require instruments, the instruments which they employ must likewise differ in kind. But life is action and not production, and therefore the slave is the minister of action. Again, a possession is spoken of as a part is spoken of, for the part is not only a part of something else but wholly belongs to it. And this is also true of a possession. The master is only the master of the slave, it does not belong to him, whereas the slave is not only the slave of his master but wholly belongs to him. Hence we see what is the nature and office of a slave. He who is by nature not his own but another's man is by nature a slave, and he may be said to be another's man who, being a human being, is also a possession. And a possession may be defined as an instrument of action separable from the possessor. Part 5. But is there anyone thus intended by nature to be a slave, and for whom such a condition is expedient and right, or rather is not all slavery a violation of nature? There is no difficulty in answering this question, on grounds both of reason and of fact. For that some should rule and others be ruled is a thing not only necessary but expedient. From the hour of their birth, some are marked out for subjection, others for rule. And there are many kinds both of rulers and subjects, and that rule is the better which is exercised over better subjects. For example, to rule over men is better than to rule over wild beasts, for the work is better which is executed by better workmen, and where one man rules and another is ruled, they may be said to have a work. For in all things which form a composite whole and which are made up of parts, whether continuous or discrete, a distinction between the ruling and the subject element comes to fight. Such a duality exists in living creatures, but not in them only. It originates in the constitution of the universe. Even in things which have no life, there is a ruling principle, as in a musical mode. But we are wandering from the subject. We will therefore restrict ourselves to the living creature, which in the first place consists of soul and body, and of these two, the one is by nature the ruler and the other the subject. But then we must look for the intentions of nature in things which retain their nature, and not in things which are corrupted. And therefore we must study the man who is in the most perfect state, both of body and soul. For in him we shall see the true relation of the two. Although in bad or corrupted natures, the body will often appear to rule over the soul because they are in an evil and unnatural condition. At all events, we must firstly observe in living creatures both a despotical and a constitutional rule. For the soul rules the body with the despotical rule, whereas the intellect rules the appetites with the constitutional and royal rule. And it is clear that the rule of the soul over the body and of the mind and the rational element over the passionate is natural and expedient, whereas the equality of the two or the rule of the inferior is always hurtful. The same holds good of animals in relation to men, for tame animals have a better nature than wild, and all tame animals are better off when they are ruled by men, for then they are preserved. Again, the male is by nature superior and the female inferior, and the one rules and the other is ruled. This principle of necessity extends to all mankind. Where then there is such a difference as that between soul and body, or between men and animals, as in the case of those whose business is to use their body and who can do nothing better. The lower sort are by nature slaves, and it is better for them, as for all inferiors, that they should be under the rule of a master. For he who can be and therefore is another's, and he who participates in rational principle enough to apprehend but not to have such a principle is a slave by nature, whereas the lower animals cannot even apprehend a principle. They obey their instincts, and indeed, the use made of slaves and of tame animals is not very different, for both with their bodies minister to the needs of life. Nature would like to distinguish between the bodies of free men and slaves, making the one strong for servile labor, the other upright, and although useless for such services, useful for political life in the arts both of war and peace. But the opposite often happens, that some have the souls and others have the bodies of free men, and doubtless, if men differed from one another in the mere forms of their bodies, as much as the statues of the gods do from men, all would acknowledge that the inferior class should be slaves of the superior. And if this is true of the body, how much more just like that, how much more just that a similar distinction should exist in the soul. But the body of the body is seen, but the beauty of the body is seen, whereas the beauty of the soul is not seen. It is clear then that some men are by nature free and others slaves, and that for these latter slavery is both expedient and right. Part 6. But that those who take the opposite view have in a certain way right on their side may be easily seen, for the words slavery and slave are used in two senses. There is a slave or slavery by law as well as by nature. The law of which I speak is a sort of convention, the law by which whatever is taken in war is supposed to belong to the victors. But this right many jurists impeach, as they would an orator who brought forward an unconstitutional measure. They detest the notion that because one man has the power of doing violence and is superior in brute strength, another shall be his slave and subject. Even among philosophers, there is a difference of opinion, the origin of the dispute, and what makes the views invade each other's territory is as follows. In some sense, virtue, when furnished with means, has actually the greatest power of exercising force, and as superior power is only found where there is superior excellence of some kind. Power seems to imply virtue, and the dispute to be simply one about justice. For it is due to one party identifying justice with goodwill, while the other identifies it with the mere rule of the stronger. If these views are if these views are thus set out separately, the other views have no force or plausibility against the view that the superior in virtue ought to rule or be master. Others, clinging as they think simply to a principle of justice, for law and custom are a sort of justice, assume that slavery in accordance with the custom of war is justified by law, but at the same moment they deny this. For what if the cause of the war be unjust? And again, no one would ever say he is a slave who is unworthy to be a slave. Were this the case, men of the highest rank would be slaves, and the children of slaves, if they or their parents chanced to have been taken captive and sold. Wherefore, Hellenists do not like to call Hellenists slaves but confine the term to barbarians. Yet, in using this language, they really mean the natural slave of whom we spoke at first. For it must be admitted that some are slaves everywhere, others nowhere. The same principle applies to nobility. Hellenes regard themselves as noble everywhere and not only in their own country, but they deem the barbarians noble only when at home, thereby implying that there are two sorts of nobility and freedom. The one absolute, the other is relative. The Helen of Theodictes says, "Who would presume to call me servant, whom am on both sides sprung from the stem of the gods?" What does this mean but that they distinguish freedom and slavery, noble and humble birth, by the two principles of good and evil? They think that as men and animals beget men and animals, so from good men a good man springs. This is what nature, though she may intend it, cannot always accomplish. We see then that there is some foundation for this difference of opinion, and that all are not either slaves by nature or freemen by nature, and also that there is in some cases a marked distinction between the two classes, rendering it expedient and right for the one to be slaves and the others to be masters, the one practicing obedience, the others exercising the authority and lordship which nature intended them to have. The abuse of this authority is injurious to both, for the interest of part and whole of body and soul are the same, and the slave is a part of the master, a living but separated part of his bodily frame. Hence, where the relation of master and slave between them is natural, they are friends and have a common interest, but where it rests merely on law and force, the reverse is true. Part 7. The previous remarks are quite enough to show that the rule of a master is not a constitutional rule, and that all the different kinds of rule are not, as some affirm, the same with each other. For there is one rule exercised over subjects who are by nature free, another over subjects who are by nature slaves. The rule of a household is a monarchy, for every house is under one head, whereas constitutional rule is a government of free men and equals. The master is not called a master because he has science, but because he is of a certain character, and the same remark applies to the slave and the free man. Still, there may be a science for the master and science for the slave. The science of the slave would be such as the man of Syracuse taught, who made money by instructing slaves in their ordinary duties. And such a knowledge may be carried further so as to include cookery and similar menial arts, for some duties are of the more necessary, others of the more honorable sort, as the proverb says, slave before slave, master before master, for all such branches of knowledge are servile. There is likewise a science of the master, which teaches the use of slaves, for the master as such is concerned not with the acquisition, but with the use of them. Yet this so called science is not anything great or wonderful, for the master need only know how to order that which the slave must know how to execute. Hence, those who are in a position which places them above toil have stewards who attend to their households while they occupy themselves with philosophy or with politics. But the art of acquiring slaves, I mean of justly acquiring them, differs both from the art of the master and the art of the slave, being a species of hunting or war. Enough of the distinction between master and slave. Part 8. Let us now inquire into property generally and into the art of getting wealth in accordance with our usual method, for a slave has been shown to be a part of property. The first question is whether the art of getting wealth is the same with the art of managing a household, or part of it, or instrumental to it. And at the last, whether in the way that the art of making shuttles is instrumental to the art of weaving, or in the way that the casting of bronze is instrumental to the art of the statuary, for they are not instrumental in the same way, but the one provides tools and the other material. And by material, I mean the substratum out of which any work is made. This wool is the material of the weaver, bronze of the statuary. Now, it is easy to see that the art of household management is not identical with the art of getting wealth, for the one uses the material which the other provides. For the art which uses household stores can be no other than the art of household management. There is, however, a doubt whether the art of getting wealth is a part of household management or a distinct art. If the getter of wealth has to consider whence wealth and property can be procured, but there are many sorts of property and riches, then are husbandry and the care and provision of food in general parts of the wealth getting art or distinct arts. Again, there are many sorts of food, and therefore there are many kinds of lives, both of animals and men. They must all have food, and the differences in their food have made differences in their ways of life. For of beasts, some are gregarious, others are solitary. They live in the way which is best adapted to sustain them. Accordingly, as they are carnivorous or herbivorous or omnivorous, and their habits are determined for them by nature in such a manner that they may obtain with greater facility the food of their choice. But as different species have different tastes, the same things are not naturally pleasant to all of them, and therefore the lives of carnivorous or herbivorous animals further differ among themselves. In the lives of men, too, there is a great difference. The laziest are shepherds who lead an idle life and get their subsistence without trouble from tame animals, their flocks having to wander from place to place in search of pasture. They are compelled to follow them, cultivating a sort of living farm. Others support themselves by hunting, which is of different kinds. Some, for example, are brigands, others who dwell near lakes or marshes or rivers or sea in which there are fishermen, and others live by the pursuit of birds or wild beasts. The greater number obtain a living from the cultivated fruits of the soil.